Hello, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dawn Martin, your MC for today's live streamed event and the Executive Vice President of Ceres, a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies from around the world on a host of global sustainability challenges, including the climate crisis and its devastating impacts on our water systems and forests. I want to start today by saying that our hearts go out to all those seriously affected by the global pandemic. And we're especially grateful to those on the front lines risking so much and working hard to ensure that we all stay as healthy and safe as possible. I also want to express our deep thanks to our participants. We realize that your personal and professional lives have been profoundly disrupted in many, many ways. So your participation here with us all speaks volumes. The generous commitment of our speakers and sponsors who have stood by us through this digital journey to Reimagine Series 2020 must also be acknowledged. We clearly would not be here today without your important support, so thank you. The fact that together we were able to transform Series 2020 into a digital program is a testament to our shared commitment and conviction to address the dual existential threats that are plaguing our global community. Challenges like extreme droughts, floods, fires, and even the spread of infectious disease have been unfolding right before our eyes and are being fueled by the climate crisis, water scarcity, and deforestation. The good news is that some of the solutions, like ensuring the resiliency of forests to capture carbon and lessen the outbreak of disease, are within our reach. Scientists have warned us that we are nearing a dangerous tipping point, and to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and more human suffering, we all know that we need to act now to keep global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Investors in companies, many of you who are joined us here today, have the ability to propel quicker, high-impact solutions. And at Ceres, we stand by to support you, and we'll be working in new ways in the coming months to continue to encourage the private sector action necessary to tackle our sustainability challenges within our new reality. In the past year alone, we've seen an important surge in government and investor corporate action. Nearly half of the world's GDP is generated in areas that have committed to reduce their emissions to net zero by 2050 or earlier. That's real progress. And that means that we are nearing another potential tipping point. More and more investors and companies are managing sustainability risks and are capturing the opportunities in the transition to a sustainable economy, a place where no company, no investor, no one wants to be a laggard in the sector. But we need more than commitments. We need bold action at the speed and scale required, and we can't wait till 2050. As we rebuild our communities and the economy in the coming months and years ahead, we need to ensure that we don't lose our momentum. Our work must continue, and that's why we're here today. So as we begin today's session, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire and Scaling Up Action to Tackle the Climate Crisis, I first have a few housekeeping notes. First of all, please note that this session is being recorded, so we'll be providing all the participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel, and we'll do our very best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. And so it is now my great pleasure to introduce Harvard Business School professor Rebecca Henderson, who is also an active and extremely valuable member of the board of directors of Ceres. Rebecca is the author of the forthcoming book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, that will be published on April 28th. She's also the John and Natty MacArthur Professor at Harvard University, where she has a joint appointment at the Harvard Business School and teaches the acclaimed course, Reimagining Capitalism. She was also awarded Teacher of the Year at MIT Sloan School, where she's inspired her students on the economics of innovation and showing how large organizations can reinvent themselves. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the British Academy, among many other academic prizes, Rebecca has been on a number of boards and has consulted on numerous Fortune 500 companies. She's routinely invited to speak to executives around the world, and so it is my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Henderson. Thank you, Rebecca.
Dawn, thank you very much for that introduction. And Mindy and the entire series team, thank you very much for arranging for me to be with you today. I must say, I was hoping to be standing on a stage in New York, talking to everyone that's on this call face to face. I know we all were. Our lives and our plans have been completely upended. And I'm going to suggest that there's some hope in this, that COVID-19 is plausibly going to lead us to move faster and harder and do the right thing. But that's where I want to close. Let me open with telling you two things. The first is, I am nervous as a kitten giving this talk. This is my first talk on video, and it is very strange. So my apologies if it's not as smooth as I would normally like. The second thing I want to open with is the important thing. I want to talk about why it's so important to reimagine capitalism and how we can do it. And I think standing where we are, if you're on this call with me, you're privileged. You're probably warm, you're probably safe, you probably have a steady job. And we're in a moment where the costs of half the population being $400 away from disaster are really coming home. We're in a moment when we see that government is not functioning to keep our society safe and well, or may run into significant difficulties. We're in a super difficult moment. We need to reimagine capitalism. I'm a huge fan of capitalism. In the nearly 60 years since I was born, world GDP has quintupled. GDP per head has tripled, and that's largely the result of the free market. The incredible innovation and efficiency and drive unleashed by capitalism is, I think, absolutely critical to our survival as a race. And indeed, we will never solve the problems of climate change or inequality without the power of capitalism. But at the moment, our system is wildly out of balance. We've created a capitalism in which firms can privatize the profits and socialize the risks, in which it's quite legal to throw greenhouse gases out the window in nearly every jurisdiction on the planet, to dump plastic into the ocean, to treat employees as disposable objects, and to take most of the returns for oneself. And that is not an acceptable outcome going forward. So what can be done? The obvious solution is to rebuild our public institutions, to create a strong civil society, to build a strong, transparent democracy, and to elect a government that is willing to balance capitalism, to put in place a price for carbon, to put in place education and health spending that will allow everyone to participate in our modern societies. That's the easy back of the envelope solution, right? Just fix government, make it responsive, accountable, and widely supported, and we're done. Now, of course, that's so much easier to say than to do. And I'm going to suggest that the best placed actor to reimagine capitalism might be business itself. Why do I say that? I say it because business has a very strong case for action. It's going to be much harder to make money in a world in which the seas are rising, all the major ports are underwater, the harvests are failing, and hundreds of millions of people are on the move. It's going to be increasingly difficult to make money in a world in which our institutions are failing, in which there's a real risk of populist governments coming to power, in which authoritarianism is becoming increasingly strong. So there's a clear collective case for action, for business to come together to rebuild our institutions and to rebuild the system. The trick, of course, is that there's the temptation to free ride. And I'm on the board of two major Fortune 500 companies. And I know that what's important is making payroll, especially at a time like this. So it's one thing to say there's a collective case. How do we actually get it done? I'm going to suggest there are 5 steps. I'm not going to tell you that these steps are easy or cheap. but I do think they're possible, and most importantly, I think they're already underway. Indeed, I think the first three you'll find very familiar. The last two, a little bit more controversial, but I think we can see the foundations of the last two steps in place right now as well. So what are the three steps to reimagining capitalism in 5 minutes? Step one, we clearly need to double down on creating what my colleague Michael Porter calls shared value. That is building business models that create value for employees, for the society, and that address environmental problems while making money for the firms concerned. We need more firms like Walmart and Herman Miller and Danone, firms that are doing all they can to make sure that they do well and do good. That's clearly not enough to solve the problems that we face, but it's hugely important. In many cases, it can drive the transformation of entire industries. We're seeing that in the case of electric vehicles, where Tesla's made so much difference. We're seeing it in the case of plant-based foods, where firms like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods are illustrating the way in which purpose-driven firms determined to create shared value can tip entire industries. The second step is scaling these efforts up to the industry level, is supporting firms in cooperating in addressing important issues that can only be addressed at the industry level. Here are examples like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil and the efforts in beef and soy, in human rights, in the textile supply chain are examples of what this might look like on the ground. Firms coming together to say, we must address these problems. If we don't, we may all suffer. Let's make them pre-competitive. Let's all agree not to throw greenhouse gases out the window. Let's all agree not to throw our waste into the river. None of us will suffer if we all agree, and our reputations will be preserved and the health of our long-term supply chains will also be preserved. So cooperation is the second step. Like the first one, it's clearly not enough. Cooperation is often unstable and difficult. When governments don't play ball, as we're seeing in Brazil right now, it's very hard, even for strong coalitions, to make sure that problems like deforestation don't recur. But these kinds of collaborations create enormous information about what works, and they create a constituency of firms, a group of firms that says, whoa, we're still committed to moving forward. How do we do that? And that takes us to the third step. What is the third step? This group knows that step. The third step is rewiring finance, is moving money to back those firms that are creating shared value, that are cooperating with each other, to insist that the entire economic system decarbonize, to insist that firms find ways to treat their employees in more sustainable and juster ways. This is a movement that Ceres is at the leading edge of, that is already well underway. The idea that long-term investors with very large portfolios cannot diversify away from the risk of catastrophic climate change or the death of the ocean is, I think, a profound realization that's going to yield all kinds of fruits over the next few years. So rewiring finance is tricky. However, I fear it's not enough. I think without remaking our institutions, we will not solve the problems of environmental degradation and accelerating inequality. We need to build what the development economists call inclusive institutions. The rule of law that's really free and fair, a media that speaks the truth and is rooted in the science, a democracy in which everyone participates and feels that they participate. The long-term solution to our problems is a balance of forces, balancing the incredible power and innovativeness of capitalism with a free society and a democratic process that can control its worst excesses. That's where we need to end up. And I'm going to suggest, and this is a little controversial, that business should play a role in getting us to that place. That it's not enough anymore to put your head down and say, you know, I'm doing the best I can, I'm making money, I'm dealing with environmental problems, I'm paying my employees well, I think firms also need to be stepping up and saying, you know, we need a democracy that works for everyone. We need a government that works for everyone. There are many ways to do this on the ground. There are firms now moving to try and get money out of politics. That's one of the most popular policy measures you can suggest across every party. The perception that our political process has been captured is enormously corrosive. 70% of Americans say our political system seems to be only working for insiders with money and power. We've got to get money out of politics. Firms must start insisting that money gets out of politics. This is about civics, not policies. This is about being part of a healthy, free society. Free markets only thrive when there are free politics. Business must step up and say that. Last of the 5 points, a big idea in just a couple of sentences. We need to believe, we need to act on the idea that the purpose of business is not maximizing shareholder value. Making money is a necessary means to the end, but the end is building strong and healthy societies. No one now would say, well, I'm going to employ child labor because, hey, it's amazingly profitable. That's not an okay thing to say. We need to build a society in which it's not all right to emit carbon and do nothing to mitigate it. It's not all right to argue against legislation that increases taxes that will take care of education and healthcare. It's not okay to go along when governments suppress voters in the interest of maintaining the influence of the powerful. It's not okay. So we need a cultural shift, a major cultural and ideological shift. I think you can see it happening. And I want to close by saying that I think now we can imagine it in ways that perhaps 6 months ago made these 5 steps seem pretty remote. So here's the reason I think COVID-19 offers us reason to hope. In the first place, it makes it very clear that bad things can happen. That the idea of discontinuous change is not just some line on a graph or some panicked doomsday saying, that there can be sudden shifts that might now feel real. The power of business as usual has been so strong, we've been so prosperous and so happy, that building the urgency about real change has been hard. Perhaps COVID-19 will help. Secondly, this epidemic demonstrates, like nothing else can, that we are immediately dependent on our community. I can't stay home and make money and trust that everything will be okay. We are clearly all interconnected. We clearly have responsibility for each other. So I think the cultural change may be closer. And lastly, this pandemic illustrates that the idea that the market alone is enough to give us a healthy, free society is clearly not the case. That we need a functioning government and a functioning civil society that can work in partnership with firms to build the kind of world that is so eminently possible. Nothing is guaranteed, but everything is possible. We have the resources and the technology we need to address climate change, to address inequality, and yes, to contain this epidemic and build a just and sustainable society. All we need to do is find the time and energy and passion to act. And I know that we have that. I know that it can be done. I know that we can reimagine capitalism. Thank you very much.
Rebecca, definitely something that I feel very privileged to be able to follow. Let me just say on behalf of all of us, I am hearing a virtual standing ovation. Thank you for continuing your vision for the future in your own work, sharing it with all of us and helping us to understand it. Your important insights continue to inspire us. Let me also say that you are, despite what you think, a distance learning expert. We're all learning how to survive and reimagine ourselves on video, and you did a tremendous job. There's many of us who are doing this for the first time, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I had my whole talk pinned to the screen, so I'm trying. I think we'll all have to learn to do this, but we're so fortunate to have this technology. Imagine a few years ago, we would have just had to cancel the entire conference. And now we can be together in a way that feels pretty good.
And you know, it's a way that we will probably learn to, regardless of what happens with our future, learn to find the benefits of this and learn how to really connect with people so far away from us in ways we never thought imaginable in the past. So I also want to say that you're a strategic mentor to all of us at Ceres, and we are very grateful now to have your book on our desks every day to guide our work. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you very much.
Some of the phone calls from back and forth.
No, it's an honor and a pleasure to be part of Ceres. It's an amazing organization, and I'm so proud.
Well, thank you. And now I have to say it's my great pleasure to introduce another mentor and wonderful part of the Ceres team, Helen Wildsmith. Helen is the Stewardship Director for Climate Change at CCLA, which for those of you who don't know is a UK-based investment firm that manages investments for UK charities, religious organizations, as well as the public sector. At CCLA, Helen has been successful in encouraging companies to manage climate risks and opportunities for so long now. She's been instrumental in driving investor and company action on climate change through several important initiatives, including Aiming for A and Climate Action 100+, as well as the Investor Agenda and the Powering Past Coal Alliance. We're very proud to have you as a longtime partner for all of us at Ceres and across our community. In recognition of your global and extraordinarily important work, I'm delighted to inform you all that Helen has been awarded the prestigious 2020 Joan Bavaria Award for building sustainability into the capital markets. So another virtual round of applause for you, Helen.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you. Ceres and Trillium Asset Management announced the award earlier today, so we're thrilled to have you with us. The Joan Bavaria Award, which is named after the founder of Ceres, is given annually to honor inspiring global leaders working to move capital markets towards a system that balances economic prosperity with social environmental issues, many of which we just heard from Rebecca. So for those of you who want to learn more about this, there's more information and the press release posted on the Ceres website at ceres.org. And included in the link is a beautiful video by Helen offering her acceptance remarks. So heartfelt congratulations to you, Helen. On behalf of all of us at Ceres, we're very grateful for your pioneering leadership. And with that, I'd like to invite Rebecca and Helen to engage in a dialogue to inform us all of your latest thinking. Thank you so much. And then afterwards, I'm going to just remind everyone that there will be an opportunity for question and answers. So please enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel on the right side of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible at the end of the session. So Rebecca, please move forward.
Sure. So Helen, first, congratulations on your receiving the Joan Bavaria Award. That's amazing. And having had the chance to take a look at some of the things you've accomplished over the last 10 to 20 years, I can absolutely see why. You are amazing. So can I begin, not quite at the beginning, but with the Aiming for A initiative that you founded in 2012? Which seems a huge amount of time ago, but I had the pleasure of reading a piece in which you described like the decision that no, we had to get investors focused in this issue, and you were really out in front of people. So congratulations, that's fantastic. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that initiative. You mobilized a number of large investors to engage with companies on climate change, and I see, and I'm just checking my notes, you got to engage with companies like BP and Shell. What was that like at that time? What sort of experience did you have when you walked in and said, you've got to fix this, or investors really care? What happened?
Well, thank you firstly, and thank you for your presentation. Incredibly inspiring, and I found myself nodding all the way through in agreement with many of the points. And you know, like you, this is a little bit nerve-wracking doing this over the internet, and we're having a Royal Air Force flyby, so every so often it gets very loud. So apologies in advance to if that happens while I'm speaking. Um, but yes, just thinking back, and you're right, it is such a long time ago. And a number of us at that time were thinking about the fact that the most important strategic issue for electrical utilities, oil and gas companies, the big diversified miners with exposure to coal, was really climate change and what was their role in the systemic change. And of course, if you work in the financial markets, you're very aware that the short-term noises are so loud that the voice of the long-term investor can very easily get drowned out. So I was really puzzling through how could we amplify the voice of the long-term investor, and realized that actually if we came together and had a group of investors who agreed that they would walk by the side of these companies as they were playing their role in this transition, then we could hopefully start to nudge the systemic change that we all need to see. So we focused in on about 10 FTSE 100 companies who we thought were very systemic to the change, either on the demand or the supply side.
And you focused on BP and Shell in particular?
Yes, I mean, we had lead engagers and backup engagers for every single company. And at that time, I was, at the beginning, I was a lead engager for BP and also for BHP Billiton. And I was backup to Rathbones on Shell and back up to the local authority pension fund forum on Rio Tinto.
What were you able to accomplish at that early stage? What were the firms willing to do?
Well, I think in the first stage, it was really about building the relationship to have these longer term discussions. And by the time we got into 2013, we teamed up with the SERA's Carbon Asset Risk Initiative, and also we're working quite closely with the IIGCC corporate engagement program here in Europe. And one of the things that we negotiated was that if we kept the group of investors who were engaging with the company permanent, would they keep a group of what turned out to be about 8 of their very senior executives as part of their engagement team? So we developed this concept called the 8 to 8. It got called, where we had 8 investors engaging with 8 very senior people, particularly at BP at that time. And this meant that for all of us, we didn't have to continuously re-go around the learning curve in terms of the issues we were talking about, and also the critical interpersonal relationships. And we were really focusing on two key things. One was strategic resilience and the portfolio resilience in terms of the businesses and the reserves that they have, and also, as you critically say, public policy advocacy as well.
And did you take those same techniques into Climate Action 100? You were a key player in the development and design of Climate Action 100, and that now has 450 investors with 40 trillion assets under management. What are some of the results that you've been able to achieve in the past year, and what are some of your key priorities going forward?
Yeah, so back in 2017, we actually merged Aiming for A into the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change's corporate program. And Aiming for A was one of many projects that were the experimentation that led to Climate Action 100 Plus. And I think there were things that people were innovating in all the forerunners to Climate Action 100 Plus that we're now using on a day-to-day basis. And I think one of the things from Aiming for A was keeping that engagement team constant. So obviously it changes slightly over time, but mostly we've got the same set of investors engaging with the companies over time. So you build up that relationship and understanding. And just thinking across to where you are in the US, I think I'm incredibly impressed with the pace of change that we're seeing in the US electrical utilities companies at the moment. There's sort of fantastic net zero commitments for 2050 and some really inspiring 2030 targets that we're seeing. And it's also just wonderful to see the large US fund managers joining Climate Action 100 Plus. In that very initial setup period, Oliver, who's the program manager at IIGCC, and I set ourselves the challenge of getting all the 10 largest European fund managers to sign up by the formal launch of Climate Action 100 Plus, and we just made it. So it's great to see that spreading to the US now.
Congratulations, that's fantastic. Do you think that the investor coalitions are the most important force in getting firms like the electric utilities to make these commitments? A helpful force? I mean, I know this is a leading question, but how much difference do you think these investor coalitions are making?
I think that this is a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral change that we're seeing, and obviously a lot of economic factors and policy factors and technological factors as well. But fundamentally, the investors, the asset owners, are the long-term holders of these companies. So they are a critical voice. And in the journey with some of the Aiming for A companies, I have seen some of the internal change management materials being used by those companies. And the requirements of the investors are always highlighted within those. And if you look at it the other way around, it's very hard sometimes for companies to take a longer term, more purpose-driven perspective if they haven't got their investors behind them.
So it's perhaps a necessary but not sufficient condition that having investors lined up is enormously helpful, but then perhaps engagement with other stakeholders, building the business case and so on is also key.
Yes.
That's right. Could you tell us a little bit about the investor agenda, which again is something that you were a central figure in the design and launch of? I went quickly to the website and it looked amazing. I mean, as if you were supporting investors in taking action on a whole range of fronts. Could you tell us where the idea came from and what you're hoping to achieve with it?
Yes, no, I had the great privilege of being part of the Phase Zero team, as we called it, with Chris Fox from Ceres, and I was in my capacity as a strategic advisor to CDP, and Sagarika from the Principles of Responsible Investment, and plenty of help from the other 4 partners within the investor agenda as well. And we'd realised collectively, little by little, that because we got this great strength of having regional investor groups and different global groups focusing on different aspects of the financial system, sometimes that can be confusing for the policymakers. They need to know who to call, that great quote about who do you call in Europe. So we thought that by having something that said we're all working together, we're expecting investors to really think carefully about their portfolios, their stewardship with companies, their own disclosure, and how they are interacting with policymakers would just mean that we were more powerful together. And we're actually building on that through a subgroup managed by Ceres and the UNEP Finance Initiative to actually encourage investors to have climate action plans that cover all four of those areas that I mentioned, so that we can demonstrate that we're part of the coalition of the willing and that we're stepping up to this challenge of collectively getting to net zero by 2050.
What are the major obstacles to really moving the entire private sector as you see them? What are some of the barriers you're still grappling with?
Yes, interestingly, one of the things that we've been increasingly thinking about is that a lot of the sectors that we look at within Climate Action 100 plus, in some markets, it's a mixture between private players and public players, whether that's state-owned industries or the heavy involvement of regulation in particular regions. And we're experimenting as CCLA a little bit at the moment by allocating a considerable amount of my time to the UK and Canadian government's Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is trying to say this is all so complex that we need to work across the value chain and across all those different actors. So it's a coalition of governments, subnationals like US states, cities, electrical utilities, some of their key customers, some of their key banks, insurers, investors, and we're all trying to work out how do we phase out thermal coal in the OECD by 2030 and then across the rest of the world. And as you said, how do we do that in such a way that it's an effective and rapid enough transition, but it's also a just transition?
Mm-hmm. We've been talking mostly about climate change. Do you engage around social issues at all? Around issues of employee pay or sick pay, which is such a hot issue at the moment. I mean, the idea that there are people who are being forced to come to work because even though they feel ill because they don't have sick pay and they're, you know, a week away from not being able to pay the mortgage is very, very sobering. Is that an area for you as well?
Yes, well, CCLA is owned by its client funds. So the agendas of the churches and charities in the UK are really sort of close to our heart. And we think that some of these very big systemic issues are incredibly important. So I'm not involved personally, but colleagues at the moment are helping build coalitions around modern slavery and mental health issues. And we've also historically done a lot of engagement work in the UK on the issue of the living wage before the UK government adopted the concept of the living wage itself.
It's interesting. When I first began teaching Reimagining Capitalism, I thought I would focus it mostly on the question of climate change, which I think is an existential threat and wakes me up at 4 in the morning and we have to deal with it. But I've come to believe that until and unless we address some of the enormous social issues we have, it's going to be hard to build a political coalition that will let us really address climate change. And that so that the two sort of need to go hand in hand in some situations. Although, of course, I'm a big fan of focusing on climate and making sure that that's at the top of the agenda.
Yes, and the Powering Past Coal Alliance, I'm glad to say, has a Just Transition Task Force, which it's incredibly important. We need to keep everyone with us as we move forward to a sustainable and socially just society.
Right. Dawn, you've popped up. That looks as though you're reminding us that we can take questions, yeah?
Well, I guess that is what it means. I'm not in control of the magic switches, but thank you to everyone who is helping us move through this online experience. First off, thank you so much, Rebecca and Helen, for that robust and maybe even more important in these times, heartwarming and inspirational conversation. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and insights. And while you've been talking, we've had a lot of thought-provoking questions that have come in through the chat box. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to cast or post your question, please Remember that you can do that to either Rebecca or to Helen in the chat box that's on your control panel. So with your permission, let me turn to a few of those. And the first question, actually, several people have provided the form of this question, is for Rebecca. Very timely. So Rebecca, how will the impacts of the global pandemic and the current global economic crisis make reimagining capitalism and the work that needs to follow more challenging? The second part, does the current context also open up any new possibilities for reimagining capitalism?
I think COVID-19 will have plausibly both positive and negative effects. And it's hard to know how that will weigh out. The obvious negative possibilities include taking an enormous amount of time and energy, just sucking the air out of the conversation and the money literally out of the economy, such that when we do finally beat the pandemic, and I'm sure we will find ourselves significantly poorer and perhaps much less willing to make the investments that are required to head off long-term climate risk. I think that's the obvious risk. And that people will say, no, we just got to get the economy going again, you know, crank up the coal plants, jump into your car, don't think about it, just get the numbers back up. That's one enormous risk. A second significant risk is it frays even further the political conversation, that the question of how to deal with the pandemic becomes very polarized, and that it further frays our sense of community, at least here in the US. I think that's a possibility, although I'm really hoping it doesn't happen. I think, though, that there's all kinds of good things that could come out of this experience. I think it will be very difficult going forward for firms to say, well, my job is just to make money and someone else has to deal with everything. Because it's clear that the way we've organized our economic system is contributing to the pandemic. I mean, just here in the US, the fact that we don't have universal health care, that there's a very significant number of people without health care who are going to be deeply afraid to come into a hospital or a doctor's office, has the potential of creating very significant long-term harm to the whole society. So I think we will become much more aware of the costs of not paying attention to these problems. And I'm hoping that one way to talk about climate change will be as a risk like this. That, you know, we thought, no, it's never going to happen, it doesn't happen. Oh yeah, it was a big storm, not to worry, it's going to be fine. It may not be fine. We may start to see major events building up on top of each other. And I think that experience of sort of shared disaster may alert people, may make people take risks more seriously. And last but not least, as I said, I think that it's very clear at times like this, you need a government that can deploy resources, that can pull businesses together, that can plan for these kinds of disasters. And I hope people will get much more engaged in politics, that we will really build a democracy that is really engaged and really making a difference. That's my hope.
I think your hope is shared by many, many, many people on this call and around the world. So we have to see some reason and justification for what's happening now. And let's hope that it's about creating a better future that makes us more resilient and more sustainable. Yeah. So as you were speaking earlier, I actually had a question that a couple of other folks online have also raised. Clearly, doing a book at the scale and scope of what you did requires a tremendous amount of research. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what might have surprised you when you were reviewing this research, thinking through how you wanted to frame your thoughts in this book. Anything that really stands out that you want to share?
There are a couple of things that really surprised me. One was the fact that we can solve some of these existential crises relatively straightforwardly. When I first started learning, you know, how relatively cheap it would be to decarbonize the entire economy, I was like, what? You know, 3% of world GDP, which is a great deal of money, but is, for example, significantly less than we're going to lose this year. The idea that we have the resources and the technology to fix climate change, that was a huge surprise to me. And that we could do it without bankrupting ourselves, and indeed might plausibly create many jobs and create a lot of prosperity in moving through the transition. So that was the first surprise. And the second surprise was how was the gap between the public and private selves of many business people. I have met now so many business leaders who are passionate about making change in the world, who are deeply committed to addressing the climate crisis and thinking about the long-term evolution of agriculture and the oceans and taking care of their employees. I mean, these visionary, purpose-driven, amazing people. And so many of them are sort of reluctant to talk about that side of them in public. They're so careful, and I understand why. I completely understand why. But they're so careful to be grounded about the money and to be focused on the bottom line and to be taking charge. And of course, I'm all there for shareholders. And there's this huge disjuncture between the public and private conversations sometimes. And I think, and I hope, and I think COVID actually might be really helping us to bring those two together, so that what people say to me over a beer at the end of the day is the same thing they say to their investors and their employees and their customers, and that we really change the conversation and make it okay to talk about the fact that we're all trying to work together for a better society. I think that I was really surprised.
Well, that's great to hear, and I can't resist but to turn it over to you, Helen. This has been your life's work at understanding that the economic aspects of the changes you're looking for within the companies that you own can be managed, and sometimes, dare I say, even managed better when companies have really embraced sustainability. And what I know about you, as well as my colleagues and others share all the time, is how you have been so successful because of your personal interactions with people in so many of the companies that you all own. And I imagine that too has played a role in your ability to influence change. Do you want to comment on any of that, or anything else that Rebecca has shared so far?
Yes, no, I think it's incredibly important to remember that companies are made up of lots and lots of individuals who are dancing to all these different motivations and different tunes. And yes, I've had some extraordinary conversations with people about different things that they're thinking, inputs from their family. I think we all have to actually applaud the children of the senior executives in companies that are on these incredible journeys. They are playing a hugely influential role, changing the thoughts of their mothers and fathers, who can find themselves stuck in this system that can make us all feel that the short term is more important than the fundamentally more important longer term.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really important when we think about the role of corporations as opposed to the government, as you mentioned earlier, Rebecca. More and more, we're finding that employees and families, people around the world, are looking to corporate leaders as people that they trust and people who they understand have some of their best interests in mind. And so the more we allow our children and others to inspire those leaders, the more we increase the likelihood for this longer term change that we're all striving for. Let me ask you another couple of questions that have come up here for both of you. For you, Rebecca, in your talk, you outlined a reasonably persuasive theory of change. And I imagine, so goes this questioner, that you must really believe in it. So what are the things that keep you hopeful? And then I'd turn that same question to you, Helen. What is it that keeps you hopeful in your day-to-day work?
The students keep me hopeful. When I first started teaching Reimagining Capitalism, there were 28 people in the room. Now we have 300. And the course has been so successful that the dean asked me to take over our first year course in leadership and corporate accountability and bring some of the ideas to the first year. And that's an enormously exciting thing to do. I think business schools everywhere waking up to the need to teach about this and to prepare the next generation of leaders to really act in ways that will strengthen our system. So that keeps me super helpful. The other thing that keeps me super helpful is when I was just going through the world and I would say to people, people would say, well, what are you doing, Rebecca? I'd say, well, I'm working on a book called Reimagining Capitalism. And they go, whoa, I want to read that book. I mean, there's so much interest and engagement in these questions. I think there's really a sense that we are in danger of moving past a point of no return and we must shift. So I think the public conversation is really changing. And then the third, and I'll stop, is just the technology. I was at MIT for 20 years and teaching innovation and technology strategy, and the stuff that's coming out of the labs is amazing. We can do this. We can really build a healthy society in which everyone is employed and we can do cool things and stop destroying the planet. It's absolutely possible. And so that's the third thing.
So Helen, tell us a little bit about what inspires you to mobilize investor action on the climate crisis that you are such an expert in. And again, maybe in the context of this immediate crisis and economic downturn, how are investors thinking about the critical work ahead and the ways in which we can move it forward in the months and years to come?
Yeah, so I always think it's a race between the physical tipping points and the societal tipping points. And I see, a lot of hopeful signs in terms of the pace really picking up. And I'm also inspired actually about a lot of the things that we have achieved quite often actually after very tragic shocks to the system like we're going through at the moment. Like Rebecca, I think there are potential sort of very dark scenarios that could come out of this, but I am hopeful that we will see greater unity and greater solidarity and multilateralism and a determination to take some of the risks that are obvious risks more seriously. Pandemics are always high in the nation's risk strategy. And you can see how we haven't kept ourselves really prepared for that. So, your comment that this will remind us of, precautionary approaches, risk management, we need to really take notice of those. But yes, I think it's sometimes rational to be pessimistic, but I think it's incredibly human to be hopeful. And we have achieved so much as a species. I'm sure we're up to these shorter term and longer term challenges that we face.
Absolutely, thinking a lot about survival of the fittest right now. So we have another question here that's come in for you, Helen, which reads, what suggestions do you have for investors seeking to align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement's goal and to set a target for net zero emissions by 2050? What advice do you have to investors who are seeking to develop climate action plans to move toward the net zero emission targets and to act on all 4 areas of the investor agenda? Glad folks out there are paying attention to that.
Yes. So I think the really key thing to keep in mind is that it's less about your own portfolio and it's about the impact in the real world economy. And therefore, we need to be thinking about who is really allocating the capital, the difference between the primary market and the secondary market. And that's why corporate stewardship is so important. Quite often what we're doing as investors is essentially swapping bits of paper between us, but it's the boards of the big companies that are doing the real capital allocation, especially in the listed equities market. And then the policy part of the investor agenda, quite often companies can get to the limits of what they can achieve in the current policy context. So we and they have to be part of shifting the policy so that we can adapt. And I do agree, the technological shifts we're seeing are making all of that easier. So I think when people are writing their climate action plans, keep in mind the real world impacts and the fact that this is a sort of multi-sectoral challenge, and we will need to have to work across boundaries and across the whole of value chains to make a difference.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. We just have a few more minutes left, so let me try to sneak in another question here for you, Rebecca. In your remarks, you spoke about corporations having to support democratic institutions and public policies. However, today, companies often engage in lobbying and political spending in direct conflict to a just and sustainable society. You mentioned a bit about policy. The question here is, how do you incentivize companies to do responsible policy engagement rather than spending the millions that they currently do on lobbying and political spending for short-term gains?
There's always a temptation to focus on the short term. Helen has spent most of her career trying to persuade firms to focus on the long term, right, Helen? It's always the struggle. I think the way you do it is in groups. Historically, firms have decided to change the way they engage with politics in groups. When there have been major disasters, major breaks, when it's clear that what's happening really isn't going to work anymore, then what you see is the big business associations stepping up and saying, whoa, we need to do this differently. And so I think what it would look like on the ground are groups like the Chamber of Commerce or the BRT stepping up and saying, you know, we all love lobbying. It's been great for us in the short term, but as a whole, it's completely degraded trust in the political system. It's led to all kinds of negative outcomes. We need to stop. We need to stop together. Now, I know that sounds like, whoa, super hard, except that you see signs of this beginning to happen. You see the Chamber of Commerce acknowledging the reality of climate change. You see BRT talking about the purpose of corporations. And you see, I mean, I've been speaking to many CEOs about these issues. They know that the system is not very stable, that something bad could happen. And if everyone can lobby, that means every politician can ask for money. So pulling money out of the system might in fact be in everybody's interest. And I think it's catalyzing that will make it happen.
Well, great, thank you. And with that, I sadly have to say we need to wrap up. But I want to say congratulations again to you, Helen, on winning the 2020 Joan Bavaria Award, and to you, Rebecca, on your book that will hopefully motivate us all to reimagine capitalism for the better. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of you for taking part in today's session. And before we adjourn, I wanted to take a special note to thank all of the sponsors who have supported Series 2020 and the transformation from our in-person program to this digital program. We certainly could not do it without your support, so thank you all. And please note that you will receive a follow-up email with a recording of this session, but hopefully you'll share it with your friends and colleagues. And for those of you who are part of the Series 2020, we'll have another session tomorrow, March 26th at 12 p.m. on defining the value of water. To register, please go to series2020.org. And thank you all so much. Please be safe and be healthy. This session is now adjourned.